For the drivers of food system, I just wanted to take you through some of the important drivers which we discussed. And I think the global policy, the trade policy, and all are very important drivers, especially from the low middle income country context. As you can see, liberalization and other aspects can be a critical input in making food more sustainable or making food systems more complete, more nutrition sensitive. But we need to have supportive policies in terms of or an ambience or an enabling environment wherein we have enough finances, where we have higher educational level, better governance. Otherwise, with trade liberalization, it so happens that if we don't have nutrition sensitive policies, perhaps we have all kinds of wrong foods being dumped into our markets. For example, there used to be differential policies in terms of packaged foods and how some of the preparations in low middle income countries still continue to have palm oil and vegetable oil, whereas those were totally withdrawn from those products in the high income countries because they had strong nutrition sensitive policies. So it is very important that trade, along with trade liberalization, comes a lot of higher understanding of the context, a trans-sectoral policy, which in turn kind of takes care of the nutritional impact of such liberalization. That was one point I had discussed. And they are very upstream policies. That's another problem. Downstream policies are also sort of listens to the people who are or the service beneficiaries, but upstream policies are taken up at the global level, are liberalizing things, having trades between the countries, which is good for the economy. But from the nutrition perspective, perhaps that is how the economic drivers have a great role to play in making in addressing our food systems. And then I had also discussed about urbanization and the rural urban connect, wherein the urban population creates demand for some kind of foods, and the rural population, for them, it is the livelihood to provide that food to the urban population. So there is a market, there is an increased demand, there is income increase in the urban population, which leads to or which sort of dictates what the rural population is producing. But this continuum needs to have a nutrition sensitiveness. That is where we will be able to produce what is healthy, and people with their knowledge and awareness demand for healthy foods. For example, people are going for organic. So farmers are going for organic farming. They're getting a good market from it. But it is also important that these markets, with the economies of scale, produce a lot so that all people start asking for those organic foods, and there is an equity component also, because we see a lot of inequity in terms of organic foods because it is expensive. So those who really need those organic foods, perhaps they are consuming, they're getting money selling those organic foods and consuming all those packaged foods, non-perishable. So it is very critical that you create a market for everybody, so that the person who's producing the organic food is also able to consume that. And that is how you create a system wherein there is an equitable distribution of healthier foods for everybody. So you need to think about food systems from that lens, the lens of equity, the lens of sustainability, the lens of being climate friendly, planet friendly, the lens of having some kind of trade policy which creates an enabling environment for everyone. There is minimal inequity between the high income group as well as the low income group, the high income countries as well as the low income countries. So the policies, programs, everything has to work around those principles. With that, we will move on to the next session that I'm taking. In between, you had two sessions, and I'm sure Dr. Chandorkar has introduced you to sustainable food systems, how sustainable food systems can address some of the nutritional issues and other aspects of sustainable food systems. Today, we will go a bit more in depth or take a deep dive into understanding resilient and sustainable food systems. And today I'm going to discuss some theories also. So these theories are important for you to design sustainable food systems. The theories which will sort of guide you how to approach this food systems transition to sustainable food systems and what are resilient food systems. And there's a short video on nature-based solutions also. So this is what I'm planning for today. And can you see my next slide? The presentation outline is taking a deep dive into sustainable and resilient food systems, the measures of sustainable diet and resilience, and a few slides on nature-based solutions. Akansha, my slides are moving now?
Yes.
All right. So, just so sorry. So, what are sustainable food systems? So, let's recap. What are sustainable food systems? Um, These systems promote food and nutrition for all, safeguards ecology, social, cultural, and economic basis of food security, and ensures availability for future generations. This requires both minimizing negative environmental impact and fostering socio-economic welfare. Sustainable food systems must protect and respect rather than exploit the ecosystem, biodiversity, social equity, and human well-being. And of course, it takes care of the planetary health. It's centered around fair, culturally acceptable, nutritionally adequate, healthy foods that conserve natural resources and local and indigenous knowledge. The last line is very critical. We were when before the advent of newer technologies, the things which do not respect planetary health, we did survive in this planet with our local and indigenous knowledge. So somewhere we have to bring that traditional knowledge back, or in other words, mainstream those traditional and indigenous knowledge. And if they are in the benefit of human health and planetary health, somewhere mainstream them into the modern ways of food systems. So conserving natural resources is very critical, and understanding from what the people understood about their environment, understood about their food system, how they procured produced food, processed food, learning from them and seeing wherever there is a possibility of merging that knowledge into the modern system, modern food system is something which we aspire to do. So, sustainability in food system, we need to understand in this session that in sustainable food systems development, sustainability is examined holistically. In order to be sustainable, the development of the food system needs to generate positive values along three specific dimensions. What are these three dimensions? The economic dimension, the social cultural dimension, and the environmental dimension. In most of the cases, when we talk about sustainable food systems, the first thing that comes to our mind is climate. Is it climate friendly? Is it planet friendly? But we also need to understand for the people to accept these food systems, it should be easy on their pockets. It should be culturally and socially acceptable. Then only the sustainability will happen. We can think of the planet, but we also have to think of the humans living in the planet who are going to adapt these sustainable food systems. So it's a very holistic approach. So the development of the food systems need to generate what positive values around these three aspects. On the economic dimension, a food system is considered sustainable if the activities conducted by each food system actor or service provider is commercially and fiscally viable. Fiscally means the cost, the finances. The activity should generate benefits on economic value added or are economically value added for all categories of stakeholders. So wages for the worker, taxes for the government, profits for the entrepreneurs, and food supply improvement for the consumer. So everything should be beneficial to everybody who are key actors in the supply chain. On the social dimension, a food system is considered sustainable when there is equity in the distribution of economic value added components, taking into account taking into account the vulnerable groups of the population categorized by gender, race, age, and so on. Of fundamental importance, food system activities need to contribute to the advancement of important socio-cultural outcomes such as nutrition and health, traditions, labor conditions, and also animal welfare. So you understand all these factors are very critical to be considered if we are trying to develop a sustainable food system. And lastly, of course, which we all understand and which we all think about in sustainable food system is the environmental dimension. And it is where the sustainability is determined by ensuring that the impacts of food system activities on the surrounding environment are neutral or are positive, taking into consideration biodiversity, water, soil, planetary health, animal health, carbon footprints, and minimizing biodiversity loss of food waste, food and less of food wastage, and also toxicity. So all these are important components. So are we clear that in sustainability, we are just not talking about the last dimension, but also the economic and the social sustainability? And then what are the various principles that are followed to provide sustainable diets? So realizing the difficulty in defining sustainable diets, the World Health Organization and FAO broke its definition into several principles based on health, socio-cultural, and environmental aspect. So the health aspects, as you can see on your screen, includes things like life course nutrition, which leads to better health. So it begins with exclusive breastfeeding, complementary feeding. Then it is made up of a variety of unprocessed or minimally processed food and restricting ultra processed foods and drinks. From the health aspect, it is consistent with the WHO guidelines to reduce non-communicable diseases. From the health aspect, food systems should include whole grains, legumes, pulses, and things like that. Should include safe water, safe food, safe and clean water of choice, drink of choice, and food safety aspect, moderate consumption of animal source foods, and contains minimum to no levels of pathogens, toxins, and also these are the food safety aspects, and adequate in meeting energy and nutrient needs. So it is more concerned with the nutrition security now. On the environmental front, of course, we want to maintain or reduce greenhouse gas emissions, water and land use, and so on and so forth, preserve biodiversity, minimize use of antibiotics and hormones, minimize use of plastics, and reduce food losses. And in the socio-cultural aspects, it should be built upon the local culture, culinary practices, knowledge, consumption patterns, etc., should be accessible and desirable and avoid adverse gender-related impacts. So this brings us to the food systems development paradigm. That is, in sustainable food systems, how can we create a case for sustainable food systems apart from knowing theoretically that it is ideal situation for people as well as planetary health? So apart from knowing that it works, let us create a case for sustainable food systems. So how can we do that? Now, sustainable food systems as engines of growth create value-added system that has 5 components. What are those 5 components? As you can see on your screen, it should generate salaries for workers. If you are creating a sustainable food systems, people should be able to earn enough to live a respectable life. So salaries for workers, a return on assets, that is profits to entrepreneurs and asset owners, tax revenue for the government, benefits to the consumers, and impacts on the socio-cultural and natural environment. So this value-added system sets in motion for 4 feedback loops that relate to economic, social, as well as environmental sustainability. As you can see, again and again, I'm reiterating on the 3 things: economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And how can we do that? These 4 feedback loops include investment loop, which is driven by reinvested profits and saving, a multiplier loop, which is driven by spending of increased workers' income. Then comes the progress. You can see down there, there is a progress loop, which is driven by public expenditure on the socio-cultural and natural environment, and an externalities loop, which is driven by economic, social, and environmental impact within the broader food system and other system. And all these food feedback loops directly or indirectly impacts what? It impacts poverty, food security, and hunger and nutrition. So this looks like a complex system, but there are five pathways through which we are creating value for this system. Who are we targeting to? We are targeting to every actor in the food systems, including the governments who need to generate taxes. It includes people who are accessing these systems. It includes workers who are working in these food systems, or the agricultural workers, or the food processing industry worker, or any worker for that matter. And lastly, it benefits the consumer. It also benefits or gives returns to asset to the entrepreneur. So is this figure clear to you, or do you have any questions? Because this is a little theoretical thing, but I feel that as food systems researchers, as people who are working in developing food systems intervention, we must think about the system as a whole. And in the systems thinking class in the last session also, we were talking about the dimensionality, the multidimensionality of food systems. So here we are looking at it from the benefit, like it has to be a profitable process, then only it is an economically sustainable food system. It should be socially acceptable. And lastly, it needs to be environment friendly. Okay, so any questions? I'll stop for a second. Akansha, any hands reason or anything?
There is one question which says, what does the emergency support indicate? Do
What is the
people have that?
emergency support indicator? Very nice point. So, what is the emergency support indicator? Is that we must have enough of buffer stock, and government has to pay, has to work on that particular aspect. The indicator, if you want to say, you can look at the food security indicators, the international, the ones which most of the development organizations use. There is a name for that, but you can look up FAO's latest food security documents, wherein they are looking at enough of buffer stock, whether the country is able to support the population when there is an emergency or a food aid is needed. So the emergency support is also a part of the social support system or the social safety network, which is very critical, especially for the vulnerable communities in the country. And if we have those support systems, for example, when we did Pradhan Mantri's Garib Kalyan Yojana in India during the COVID times, it was the emergency support system, a part of the food system, wherein we had enough buffer stock to give free of cost to the population who were not able to earn anything, or the unorganized sector of the population who were not earning anything during that point of time. So that emergency support system, if you can see the arrow, it goes to the poverty reduction. That is, you create a food system which takes care of the social support system for those who are most vulnerable, which indirectly affects poverty reduction and also leads to food security and, of course, nutritional status. Does that answer your question? Yes?
Yes, there is another question here, Suparna. It says that will this be coming from taxes?
Of course, it's the taxpayers' money, as well as government has its own plans, policies, and programs. But it depends. See, it's indirectly there is a dot arrow from the taxes. How does the government do its welfare programs? it earmarks a lot of its budget to have that buffer stock in the community at the population level. How does it create the buffer stock? It purchases grains through the public food procurement program from the farmers. It creates enough grain during the emergency situations. So how is it buying that grain from the farmers? It is using its own resources to buy those grains, and indirectly it is coming from the taxes, right? Anything else?
One participant has raised their hand. Is it
Yeah,
okay if they can
Nanduma.
speak? Yeah, right.
Yeah, please.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
hi. Okay, I have question regarding better food supply chain.
Mhm.
So, like India or Bangladesh, we don't have supply chain system like Walmart in USA, or like we do have many minor businessmen, then retailer, and these are bit scattered.
Mhm.
So I'm just asking how to make this supply chain in under one umbrella, and we can check the quality regarding toxins and microbes both, because in Bangladesh we have very like minor to major different kind of supply chain. We can say that dairy system we have big company like Pran, but for poultry, for other meat supplies, there are multiple. So how to make it integrated?
Very good question. And that is where the problem comes in LMICs, that our supply chains
Yeah,
are not so streamlined. And to make
right,
any program work, that is where the problem comes. For example, the simple programs like food fortification programs. If we don't have a centralized supply chain system like you're talking about in US, we have Walmart, and they are regulated by the government agencies with their certification and all, things are much more simple. But for us, it is the unorganized market which needs to be regulated. And that is where it makes middle income countries' food supply chain very unique. And that is where the regularization is a big challenge. We do have in India Food Safety Standard Authority of India, but it is an Herculean task to regulate the food supply chain, which is coming from the small subsistence farmers who are selling their cauliflower or vegetables to the middleman. The middleman is selling it in the mandi. From mandi, things are procured by the government or by the private agencies. So where all will you keep the quality checks in place and then
right.
have a kind of a streamlined supply chain? That is the biggest challenge of LMICs. But on other hand, it is creating livelihood for those farmers who are supplying to this huge or long supply, complicated and complex supply chain. So simple examples come from, for example, in Andhra Pradesh, in India, we have these Raitu Bharosa Kendra. So it is a Telugu name which says that a trust building process wherein the farmer gets his grain first tested in a lab, and then if found optimal is procured by the government. So their government has introduced a quality check, but which is going to the lowest level of the supply chain, the small farmers. Similarly, regulatory mechanisms have to be established in low middle income country context for the meat supply chain, which is very complicated, which is highly vulnerable to microbial contamination. And we see that in Northeast India, where meat supply is a part of, day-to-day diet of the people, the Safety Standard Authority of India faces a lot of challenge in regulating that supply chain because they don't have a centralized slaughterhouse where you get everything streamlined and then send it out to the people. So that becomes a very streamlined thing. If we are not establishing such centralized procurement process, the small poultry owners or the small, meat, like those who rear pigs and all, are selling it to a centralized market. So the thought process has to be that we have to actually address to the requirement of a diverse people who are the key suppliers to the food supply chain. And in case we want to centralize everything, the cost goes up because then things are transported. And if things are transported to long distances, managed in a cold storage, the environmental impact is higher. So we have to think about a middle path wherein we are regularizing or supporting the small farmers by giving them quality checks at their levels. It's like in blood test, we do point of care diagnostic, just a corollary to what I'm saying. Suppose in hard to reach places, we are looking at innovations to test blood using simple diagnostic point of care kits. Similarly, we want these quality check kits. Our food safety regulatory authorities need to think about more frugal technology, if I may say, to assess the quality of the food supply chain from the farm to the fork. We may not be able to create a centralized food system wherein you have the economic thing, the governance thing, everything well in place to have everything in a very streamlined manner where meat from different farmers are coming to a central repository. From the central repository, it's getting checked, rejected, and coming to us in packaged form with date written, best before written, and everything. To create that system, it might have an environmental impact, but to have a minimal environmental impact, yet work, not disturb the balance which has been created by the local markets, we need to have innovations in place, infrastructure in place, technology in place, which can actually do some point of care diagnostics at the lowest level, then at some level, and at the end, the customer gets a desirable product, a product which is free of pathogen. It's a Herculean task, but it's a very phrase.
So my takeaway message from your response is like using some biosensors, use some citizen scientists, and make it
Yes.
locally centralized.
Absolutely. Citizen scientists are the need of the hour. Farmers have several traditional ways of checking the quality, not letting fungus grow in their crop. They have that knowledge. We have to bring that knowledge on board. We should not say that we know it all. But yes, the knowledge that they have that needs to be married to new technology, to environmental friendly technology. And then we can have solutions which can actually regulate our traditional food systems. We can't just adopt what Walmart has done. They are giving a lot of, are they environmentally sustainable? Perhaps not, or perhaps yes. But let's learn from what Walmart has done, but take that technology to the grassroots at the farmers level rather than making everything centralized. And, sometimes eating not so fresh food. For us, a desirable food is buying the food straight from the farm. Fine. But if I look at the perception of my high income group colleagues, they will say, but it has dirt in it. How will you eat it? I said, we have traditional ways of making it clean rather than adding chemicals and putting them and making them colorful. So, people have different perceptions, but I do agree that it introduces pathogens. So, how do we limit the pathogen yet continue to get shorter supply chain? And the supply chain, the length of supply chain increases enormously if we go by a centralized supply chain, which Walmart and now we have Reliance, and we are also having mushrooming of these food chains, which are doing a farm to fork kind of a thing on their own. So they are adapting those systems, but how much of energy are they consuming? Can we think of something which can maintain the traditional supply chain, but with, as you said, citizen scientists and all researchers who provide their inputs in making this supply chain safe and low environmental impact and easy on our pocket and socially acceptable. Yeah. Anyone else wants to add? Thanks. Good point, Renuma. Somebody else switched on his camera, his or her. Or shall we move?
I think we should move ahead, Suparna.
Yeah. Okay. Why is my slide not moving? Yeah. So now you look at this. This is a resilient food system. A food system comprises of, this is a sustainable and resilient food system, as you can see on your screen. A food system comprises subsystems, including farming system, of course, it's their waste management system, and input supply system. It is also intricately connected to other systems. So when we think about food system in our mind, we say farm to fork. But apart from that, there are other related systems also, like energy, water, trade, health systems. In other words, they're drivers. The interconnectedness of these systems indicates that any structural change in the food system might originate from a change in another system. For example, we are not producing enough. The farmer said that this time my yield was very low. So what was the interconnected system? It is the climate. It has led to erratic rainfall, and that might have led to poor supply from the beginning of the supply chain. Thus, changes in the food system can be triggered by policies also that promotes, for example, more biofuel in the energy system, impacting the food system. Therefore, a food system is a complex system driven by intricately interlinked social, economic, cultural, and environmental factors which require a kind of a transformative thinking and integrated assessment tools to guide informed strategy policies that lead to sustainability in the entire process. That is the whole agricultural value supply chain, and also takes into account the resilience of that supply chain. And with that, I'm sort of introducing it to the concept of a resilient food supply chain, food system. So finally, how to achieve a sustainable food system. Um, uh, like we have been talking about, like we want to achieve, we aspire to achieve, and there are different loops which are there, the different feedback loops which feed into the various drivers of food systems or various components of food system or various dimensions of sustainable food system. But how can we finally achieve a sustainable food system? And here on the screen, you see a framework which emphasizes the development of a food system that efficiently uses resources, reduces food waste at every stage, from primary production to transformation, and finally, consumption. An efficient food system is therefore built around a circular model. And here what I'm showing is a nexus planning model or other models like circular economy model, the One Health model, the strategic foresight model, the horizon scanning, and the scenario planning. These are different names of, I have noted all these names actually. I don't remember on my own. So I have written this note with me that there are different ways of planning a sustainable food system. Here, what I'm explaining is the nexus planning based conceptual framework. And these specific planning and frameworks are different from linear models. That is, you have a linearity, a cause and an effect, but it encourages introduction of, so if you have a linear model kind of a thing, that this is the input and this is the outcome, and you are not considerate about the other things, the nexus planning, for example, that I'm showing you, it actually introduces wastes in the food environment, causing detrimental environment, human health risks, and climate change. For example, the nexus modeling, a model, as you can see here, develops knowledge-based tools that assess vulnerability and resilience, as well as recovery options and the potential of a food system. So these tools facilitate identification of pathways for simultaneous food security and resource conservation through an analysis of food systems activities and outcomes. In simple terms, as you can see, the nexus planning is just not focused on the linear thing that you produce something and you get an output which is good on your pocket or good for your environment, but it looks at or analyzes all the risks like environmental risk, the socio-economic risk, the vulnerability and resilience assessment and risk, all these being looked at. And you are also looking at the three dimensions: environmental welfare, social welfare, and finally, all the food systems activities put together leads to a food systems outcome, which makes food available down here, which makes food available, accessible, utilizable, and a food systems activity which produces, processes, packages, distributes, retails, and finally it leads to consumption. All these food systems activities can happen in a sustainable manner when we are considerate of the nexus of other drivers, and their interplay should be taken into consideration before we think of achieving a sustainable food systems. It illustrates the connected processes and interactions that are needed to achieve a sustainable food system. Now comes the concept of food systems resilience. And we know that food systems resilience is what? Resilience is what? To bounce back, right? So food systems resilience is the capacity over time of a food system and its unit at multiple levels to provide sufficient, appropriate, accessible food to all in the face of various and even unforeseen disturbances. So there is a disturbance in their environment, there is a problem, there is a COVID, the food system, the supply chain stops. Can a society bounce back on its own when such adversities happen? That is called the food system's resilience of that society. A resilient food system is able to withstand economic and environmental shocks and stresses at different temporal and spatial levels. In the context of climate change, a resilient food system anticipates risks associated with climate change and has redundancy built within. That is an effective system for stocking adequate amounts of food and for their distribution in times of crisis. As applied socio-ecological systems work to the food system, we define food systems resilience as the ability of a food system, which itself is made up of actors who produce, process, transport, and distribute food, to address stresses, disturbances, while providing stable levels of consistent nutrition to the public. And there is a fourth definition also, which is we define resilient food system as the capacity of the people to produce and access nutritious and culturally acceptable food over time and space in the face of disturbances and changes. So it's basically the ability to bounce back when there are adversities. And this is an interesting figure, so today's lecture is a little theoretical, but I felt that understanding the theory behind what we do is also critical. And that's why I made it a little theory heavy. And there is a very good article by Tyndall et al. 2015. It is open access article. Just this is your homework. Just read that article. I've borrowed several figures from that article. So the components of the food system's resilience, if we see, there are four critical components that affects the behavior of the food systems and its resilience over time. And these include robustness, that is, or the capacity to withstand the disturbances in the first place before any food security is lost. So that is how robust the food system it is. As you can see in the figure on the top, there is this disturbance which is affecting, and the dotted line is a resilient food system, whereas the dark line is a less resilient food system. So the robustness is the capacity to withstand. See, the dotted line is able to, despite of the disturbance, it is able to survive for a longer time, the blue line. Okay. Then comes redundancy, or the extent to which elements of the system are replaceable, affecting the capacity to absorb the perturbing effect of the disturbance and avoid as much food insecurity as possible. So you come and see the dip in the less resilient process. It had no food stores, it had no policies in place, it did not have buffer stocks, or it did not have the anticipation that these extremities might happen. So look at where it has gone, the less resilient food system. But the more resilient food system has the capacity to absorb through the typical, through the characteristic or the component which is called redundancy. Then comes the flexibility and thus rapidity or food system's reactivity with which the food system is able to recover any lost food security. So it had a little dip, it went up, and with rapidity, that is flexibility, it is able to recover any food security that was lost during that dip period. And then comes resourcefulness and adaptability, which determines how much of the lost food secured is recovered. That is, food security loss means during the COVID. COVID is the greatest example of this century, wherein we saw how different food systems perhaps crumbled versus the resilience of the food systems where people had shorter supply chain, people could survive the shock because of their ways of dealing with their food systems, the inherent ways of consuming what was available in the family food basket from the backyard helped the most impoverished communities also to survive this shock in a better manner as compared to the longer food systems who totally relied on the markets. And we saw how the supermarkets were looted and how things happened because they were so food insecure because their dependency was not diverse. The food systems they were accessing to was not diverse. The food environment that they were accessing was very monotonous. They were drawing everything from a monotonous outlet. Whereas think about those smallholder farmers who were managing their day-to-day routine from the backyard vegetables or going to the jungles. Their food system's resilience was much better. From the government's perspective, from the country perspective, the food systems which had multiple diverse source of foods to be accessed, shorter supply chain, they could bounce back better, build back better after that severe shock which affected the global economy, the global food systems, and everything that was global. Okay, so this is an interesting figure. Then we have this food systems resilience action cycle. So now if we look at this food systems resilience action cycle, it consists not only of reactive actions like absorb, react, restore, learn, the circle in between, as you can see, but also preventive action, that is build robustness. You can build robustness within the system. Preventive actions can also address stressors which affect the reactive capacities of the food system in response to a shock. Each action is enabled by a capacity of the food system, that is capacity to absorb, capacity to be flexible, capacity or the component of rapidity, resourcefulness, adaptability, learning capacity, and capacity to withstand. So this is also an interesting figure, which I thought I'll share with you, and just go through that Tyndall article and you will see all these are explained very well. Now, so it becomes evident that resilience and sustainability are complementary concepts. Do we all agree with this, that resilience and sustainability? If you are sustaining your food sources, you are aware of the shocks and stressors. You are predictive, you are anticipating, and you build in that resilience while continue to be sustainable also. Okay, so sustainability, which has been broadly defined as the capacity to achieve today's goal without compromising the future capacity to achieve them. Resilience can be broadly defined as the dynamic capacity to continue to achieve such goals despite disturbances and shocks, right? So sustainability implies preserving the capacity of the system to function in the future, which is also one of the conditions for maintaining resilience, right? That I have to continue without doing harm to the environment and all. So I'm also resilient while I'm sustainable. However, resilience implies the capacity to continue providing a function over time despite disturbances, and thus forms an essential part of what enables sustainability. Sustainability is the measure of systems performance, whereas resilience can be seen as a means to achieve it during the time disturbances. So sustainability is measuring the system's performances, whereas what is resilience doing? It can be seen as a means to achieve it during the time of stressors, disturbances, and other things like that. Okay. So now there are several indicators for assessing sustainable food systems. And here on your screen, I have sort of listed out these sustainability assessment indicators, and these could be health and nutrition indicators, environmental indicators, and socio-economic indicators. Now, in food sciences, or sorry, in nutrition, we often talk about direct and indirect indicators. So in one way, you can also say that nutrition and health indicators are indirect ways of assessing how sustainable and good and healthy and nutritious our food systems are. The environmental impact indicators like ecological footprint, footprints, carbon footprints, water footprints, rate of local and regional foods and their seasonality. All these are the environmental indicators, and socio-economic indicators of sustainable food systems are equity indicators. I think that should come as the first one, income and wealth indicators. So some are direct, whereas some are indirect indicators of sustainable food systems. Now, I'll just discuss a bit because this is not my subject. Life cycle assessment is often used for assessing environmental impact. Anyone in this team has actually been a part of any group who have done a life cycle assessment in low middle income country? I'll pause for a while and ask this question. Akansha, has someone risen their hands?
No one for now.
No one for now. Okay, so whenever we talk about environmental impact assessment, we get to hear this term life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is perhaps, I should not say it's not adaptable, because it is a very difficult task to do in low middle income countries because the impact factors were developed with the food production system of high income countries in mind. And the impacts are based, suppose, in high income country, they are producing rice. So that environmental impact from the rice being produced to thrashed, to polished, to milled, to packaged, to receiving the plate of a consumer is very different from the life cycle of rice, which is being procured, which is being produced by a farmer at his backyard, is processed by thrashing in his own village, maybe a hand-driven equipment is used, and then it goes or it is milled locally and is coming to his plate. So the environmental impact assessment figures that we are usually getting from the data sets and or the huge databases, sorry, are perhaps not something which has been done in low middle income. Is someone saying something?
ऑफिस में ही हो
Okay. So life cycle assessment is an important, it is a concerning gap that we have for the low middle income countries. So I would like to use this group to know if anybody is working on life cycle assessment of food grains, vegetables, fruits, and all in the low middle income country context. So as I said, LCA is perhaps not adaptable to LMIC countries because the impact factors are usually measured in the high income countries. And what happens then if we want to assess the sustainability of diets in low middle income countries, when nutrition transition is reportedly happening at an accelerated rate, we might not find a good answer. And it is a given that low greenhouse gas emission foods will also be one of low water footprints. This is also a given which has been understood by the environmental scientists, but I'm not an expert there. But what I understand from literature is that perhaps we cannot equate these two parameters. What is the greenhouse gas emission of a particular food product versus the water footprint? Is it similar? Are they, do they have a positive relationship? That is perhaps not the case because I can see an example of vegetables and fruits are reportedly more sustainable in terms of greenhouse gas emission, but some fruits and vegetables do require huge amount of water to produce. So will the water footprint be higher? So these are some foods for thought, questions for thought for those who are working, anybody in the group who are working in life cycle assessment. But this is a huge gap in nutrition, in food systems research, and environmental of food, impact of food systems research and sustainable food systems research, wherein we do not have primary data on the environmental impact of several of our food commodities that are produced in LMICs. Now, some of the studies in which sustainable diets have been measured in literature, and as you can see, in India, we only have studies on environmental indicators. There are studies internationally on nutrition and health indicators, socio-economic indicators, and consumer choices. Now, I will take you through, and what is the time? Okay, we have time. So now I will take you through this interesting metrics of measuring sustainable nutritional outcomes of food systems. Now, we are always talking about sustainable food systems and their indicators, but are we talking about what are the food security indicators of the food systems, which also takes into account sustainability? So this metrics is actually talking about that, measuring sustainable nutritional outcomes of food systems. Okay, so nutritional outcomes of food system security and its sustainability. And what are those specific indicators? As you can see, there are 7 different components which have been emphasized by Gustafsson et al. Again, another interesting piece of work which you can refer to. And you can see they're talking about food and nutrient adequacy, that is nutrient density score, non-stable energy, Shannon diversity, MFA diversity. All these indicators are used to see that the nutritional outcomes of the food system is sustainable or not. Ecosystem stability, ecosystem status, greenhouse gas emission, net freshwater withdrawn. Then we have food affordability and availability indicators. Food affordability, again, aspect of economic aspect of food system sustainability. Then we have the food safety indicators, measures, and then we have the resilience measures. So just go through them. I think we can have a course on all these specific indicators, but this is just to introduce you. Sometimes for your research work, you keep guessing what can be used. Just a second. You can just keep guessing what are the ideal indicators that we can use. Now, I had mentioned to you about the Indian think tank. The Indian government's think tank, Niti Aayog, has come up with a very recent report where they have looked at the consumption expenditure surveys and have then looked at the diversity of the food that is being consumed. And they have used this Shannon Diversity Index to look at the nutrients, like, for example, iron, and what other food sources is iron coming from. And then they have said that Indian consumers have sort of diversified their source of iron, which used to be only from staple, but is now coming from different food sources. So this is how they have used Shannon diversity to look at food nutrient adequacy. So there are innovative ways of explaining your data, and these indicators come very handy when you have to assess the sustainability or the nutritional sustainability of a food system. Okay, so just go through these indicators. I found them interesting, and this is a kind of mapping they have done in terms of the country specific. The example of food system metrics calculation of the present day conditions. The areas of the polygon represent relative national status of sustainable nutrition security. Number one is the food. So you can just see the colors. One is food nutrient adequacy, ecosystem stability, food affordability, availability, socio-cultural well-being, resilience, food safety, waste and loss reduction. And you can just look at your own country's thing, and you can just see that number 7, that is water waste and loss reduction, you can see for Bangladesh, and as you can see the other matrices for the other variables or the indicators that exist in this. Then this is another interesting thing which actually talks about the sustainability of the agri-food system, and this is from Spain government, I think, and they have sort of prepared a comprehensive methodological framework and expert consensus on the approach that can be adopted. And it's talking about different models, this different sector where that can be applied, the kind of information that they are collecting, and they are evaluating what? They are evaluating either economic, social, or environmental sustainability. Okay, so these are important resources that you can use if you're doing some exercise at the country level. Then we also have the subnational level resilience measures. Again, the measures and approaches are given in the left column, that is self-evaluation and holistic assessment of climate resilience of farmers and pastoralists, and how are they doing it? They're doing it through small group interviews, using digital technology, doing data visualization, so on and so forth. Resilience index measurement and analysis, international development enterprise market system. So complicated terms, but just to give you a flavor of what all you can do if you want to understand the sustainability and resilience of a food supply chain. What does a sustainable diet look like? So these are some of my concluding slides. A general consensus is that a sustain, and you know about the Eat Lancet, right? And that says that a general consensus is that it should have lower consumption of meat and meat products, limited consumption of dairy and dairy products, inclusion of more plant-based foods in the form of cereals, pulses, grains, and roots and tubers. And this is how it says: limit the intake of animal source food, optimize your intake of low-fat dairy products, eggs and poultry because they have lower environmental impact as compared to red meat and starches. Emphasize on fish, vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. This is in nutshell what the Eat Lancet diet is proposing. The breakdown reference shows that the whole grains are should be consumed per day, the amount consumed in the possible range of 232 grams. Now, if you see for India, I can say our latest recommended dietary intake recommendations have come. And what have they shown? They are showing that we are actually for the adult doing sedentary or moderate activity, you can have 300 to 350 grams of carbs. So this is grossly low. If we look at the Eat Lancet, this is grossly high. If we look at the Eat Lancet recommendation, which says consume around 230 grams of whole cereals, less amount of potatoes and other starches, lots of vegetables, fruits, dairy milk, which is low fat dairy milk. Protein sources are in red and they are saying very less amounts and added fats and all. So this is what is Eat Lancet Commission is propagating or promoting. And this is how colorful the plate looks if we are following the Eat Lancet diet. And this is how the recommended dietary intake versus the 2006 dietary intake globally of different foods, fruits, vegetables, and food groups. And what is the recommendation? The recommendation is at 100. And look at the red meat pulses, red meat that different countries are eating. The maximum global intake is also around 400% of recommended. The East Asian countries are also eating a lot. South Asia is green. They're eating much lesser of red meat as compared to their other counterparts. And you can look at the other regions and see how they compare with the 100% recommended dietary intake, this red one. Okay, but now coming to the affordability of consuming a planetary health diet. And here, if you can see, the range is provided in terms of the long lines that you see. The middle point and the line, the vertical line is the median intake. And this is the confidence interval that you see where, the intake is falling. And this is very broad. What the point I want to make here, for the low income country, this is very broad. And look at sub-Saharan Africa. The range is broad, but the median intake is also here. So basically, the amount of money we are spending, we need to spend to consume a planetary health diet is very high. And that actually sort of says that there are some issues around this Eat Lancet recommendation. Number one, is it able to meet the micronutrient deficiencies? Because the diets are low in essential micronutrients like vitamin B12, because animal source foods are the ones which are giving the major amount of vitamin B12. For vitamin A, again, the carotene can be achievable from all the vegetarian sources, but retinol is present in the animal source food and some of the and this is especially true for vulnerable populations. And affordability, as I've shown you in the previous slide, is a major concern. And the modeling approach has also been discussed at length, wherein people are critiquing a bit about the Eat Lancet recommendation. But having said that, it makes sense in terms of the planetary health, but it cannot be, again, one size fits all for all the countries. We cannot have a blanket prescription of Eat Lancet diet wherein we just go by reduce your red meat consumption, do this and all. Because overall consumption of at the population level cannot be brought to the granular level where people are still suffering from micronutrient deficiencies and are not contributing so much for the global greenhouse gas emission, for the little bit of portion or small portions of animal source food that they are eating. In fact, that is making them nutritionally secure. So there has to be a balance between what we are proposing and what is happening at the granular level. My last slides are on nature-based solutions. Do we have time? And I have a
We have
short
15 minutes.
Okay, so we can show a short video, right? So now people are more and more speaking about nature-based solutions. That is, make your solutions drawn from the nature rather than having add-on technologies and all to actually reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And we know food systems are a major contributor of greenhouse gas emission and environmental impact. So the nature-based solutions are solutions that are inspired and supported by nature, which are cost effective, simultaneously provide environmental, social, and economic benefits and help build resilience. Such solutions bring more and more diverse nature and natural features and processes into the cities, landscapes, seascapes through locally adapted, resource efficient, and systemic interventions. The types of nature-based solutions are interventions that are inspired or make use of natural processes. It's inspired by the nature and intrinsic making use of the nature. That is restoring ecosystems, positive impact on biodiversity. And the examples are use of microorganisms to purify wastewater, rainwater harvesting, reforestation, crop diversity, and so on and so forth. This is the video. I can show you the video later and just quickly go through the food systems approach with sustainable solutions for sufficient supply of healthy food system. And here we are just talking about the different drivers of food system and how they can work together and use natural resources to provide solutions. And here comes the circular food system. Circularity is about reduced resource consumption and emission to the environment by closing the loop of materials and substances. Searching for practices and technology that adds to the highest possible value to the food system. So what do? We have to minimize the input of finite resources, that is non-renewable source of resources like fuel, fossil fuel and all, you minimize that. Encourage the use of regenerative technology. Prevent the leakage of natural resources. Recover the material and reuse and remanufacture and recycle them, and stimulate the reuse and recycling of inevitable resource losses. So examples are elimination of waste production by reusing wastewater, carbon sequestration, multi-use of space, etc. And this is how nature-based solution for climate resilient and circular food systems work. We increase the diversity. Number one, increase the crop diversity and develop a more diverse diet for livestock and increase climate resilience of the food system. So you look at the traits which sort of mitigates climate change or is resilient to climate change. So you do spatial crop diversity, you use natural pest protection. Also, to reduce greenhouse gas emission, you are using herbs and more diverse diets for your livestock so that there is reduction in the greenhouse gas emission. And this is how we sort of create a circular food system wherein nothing gets wasted, everything is recycled. Examples are rainwater harvesting for irrigations and forest landscaping in Ghana and wastewater connectors in Netherlands. So these are some of the recommendations which are quite understandable and I don't need to read it through. But yes, there is an urgent need in every region to address dietary risk factors and related diet-related health problems. And the policy measures need to increase healthier food production. But while doing so, we need to preserve and conserve the planetary health. We need to produce food in a sustainable manner. Policy priorities need to align to dietary and food systems changes, and to reduce greenhouse gas emission, we need to go slow on using animal source foods, but there is a differential effect and differential contribution from different regions of the globe, and accordingly, policies and programs should be tuned. Now, going back to the video, let me try whether it plays on its own, or I will ask Akansha to help me. It's just an interesting video on nature-based solution. Yeah. 2020s, things were never the same after that. That's when we saved the world. Only we almost didn't. It all changed once we realized the difference working with nature could make. Back then, we were all about electric cars, renewable energy, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. And they were all crucial, but on their own, they never would have been enough. We were already facing an extinction level threat. We thought we were doing a lot, but we needed to do even more. Enter nature. The most sophisticated system for processing greenhouse gases in the universe only had hundreds of millions of years on us. We had to stop the planet from warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to the start of the 20th century. Turns out we had to be kind to nature. Hear me out. Stopping the destruction of existing forests, grasslands, and wetlands pulled 3.9 billion metric tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. Smarter farming and forestry techniques cut another 5.1 billion tons. And restoring the forests and wetlands we had lost scrubbed another 2. That's 11 billion tons of carbon removed from the atmosphere. That's like a string of SUVs stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic stretching from here to the moon 56 times over. That's 1/3 of the emission reductions we needed. How's it work, though? Pick a tree. Any tree. Look closer. Trees do this awesome thing called photosynthesis where they soak up rays of sun and pluck carbon from the air to feed themselves. They literally eat the stuff that traps heat in our atmosphere. And have you heard of mangroves? They're like trees, but they live along the coast near bays and beaches. They became all the rage when word got out they could store 5 times more carbon than their landlocked counterparts. Plus, as they age, trees, all plants really, deposit their carbon into soil. Other plants use that to grow, some of which get eaten by animals, like us, which release carbon back into the atmosphere, starting the whole process over again. It's called the carbon cycle, and it worked really well for a really long time until we overloaded the system by burning fossil fuels and cutting down too many of our forests. It can look very natural now, but protecting and restoring nature at a global level was one of the hardest things we've ever done, and we still had to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. But once we realized it would take more than switching to renewable energy, once we really partnered with nature to reduce our carbon footprint and also to live on a better planet, that's when we really started to save the world. I will go back. So that's it for today's class, and I'll stop sharing.